long before their names would strike fear into the hearts of kings, before their sails darkened the horizons of Europe, before the world called them Vikings. They were just people of the North. In the cold shadow of the Arctic Circle, where sunlight fades for months and the wind howls through pine and ice, the Norse lived, not as warriors, not as legends, but as survivors. They farmed the land when it allowed it. Thin, stony soil yielded barley, rye, and oats if the weather held. They raised sheep, goats, and hardy cattle. Inlets and fjords brought fish, seals, and whales. Every day was a calculation: how much warmth to store, how much grain to spare, how many mouths to feed. Children learned early, not just how to hunt or carve wood, but how to endure, how to listen to silence, how to interpret the cries of ravens and the rhythm of storms. Their homes were longhouses, wooden halls with turf roofs and smoky hearths at the center. Extended families gathered here, sometimes for generations. It's at night, the cold pressed in from the dark forests. But within the fire's glow, voices rose, and they told stories. They spoke of Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, of gods like Odin, who gave up an eye for wisdom, Thor, who defended the world with his hammer, and Loki, the trickster, who would one day bring ruin. These myths weren't just entertainment, they were memory, philosophy, identity. They explained why the world was harsh, why the seas were angry, and why courage in the face of death was the greatest virtue. Because in the Norse view, death was never the end. If you died well, bravely in battle, you might ascend to Valhalla, the hall of slain heroes, where warriors drank mead and trained for Ragnarok, the end of all things. But for now, they lived in the in-between. And in this in-between, between ice and fire, hunger and survival, myth and memory, the seeds of the Viking Age were sown. Around the year 700, something stirred. Not all Norsemen were content with their patch of earth. The population was growing, resources were tightening, and chieftains, local warlords who led small clans, began to push outward, not yet with violence, but with curiosity. Beyond the fjords were whispers of soft lands, gold-filled monasteries, fractured kingdoms, unguarded shores. The British Isles were ripe. Francia, though powerful, was vulnerable. Ireland, splintered. The Slavic lands, rich in trade. Even the distant east offered rivers that flowed into unknown kingdoms. But to reach them, they would need ships, and so they built them. Not lumbering merchant ships or oared galleys, but something else entirely. The longship, long, narrow, and deadly fast, made from overlapping planks, strong but flexible, designed to glide over waves or creep up rivers like serpents, with a shallow draft that allowed them to beach anywhere and leave just as quickly. They carved fierce dragon heads onto the prows, not for beauty, but to frighten spirits, to announce their arrival like a thunderclap. At first, these ships explored, traded, returned, but soon they would carry more. Axes, swords, fire. The men who stepped aboard were no longer just farmers or fishermen. They were something else now. They were becoming Vikings. And though no one could have known it then, the age of plunder, conquest, and exploration was about to begin. Not with an army, but with a whisper from the north. It began quietly. No declaration of war, no royal edict, just a single sail on the horizon. The year was 793. On the island of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England, monks rose to greet the dawn. Their days were spent in quiet worship, copying scriptures, tending gardens, and ringing bells that echoed out across the North Sea. They had no walls, they had no army, and on that morning they had no warning. Sleek ships emerged from the mist, silent as shadows, their prows curved like dragons. Warriors jumped ashore, iron in hand, rage in their eyes. They moved fast, cutting down anyone in their path. The holy place was desecrated, crosses torn from walls, altars stripped, relics taken. Monks were slaughtered or dragged away as slaves. Gold chalices, sacred books, and carved ivory gone. Word spread like wildfire. The Northmen had come. This was not the first time Norsemen had left their shores, but it was the first time they brought terror with them. The Lindisfarne raid shocked Europe, not just because of the violence, but because of what it meant. If even the church was not safe, what was? More raids followed. In 795, they struck Ireland, then Scotland, then the Isle of Man, then deeper into Anglo-Saxon England. They targeted monasteries first, not because they hated Christianity, but because these places were rich and undefended. Gold, silver, livestock, women, wine, whatever could be taken was taken. And then they vanished. No kingdom, no siege, no territory claimed, just attack, loot, leave. This was the earliest Viking strategy: speed, surprise, and the sea. To the kingdoms of Europe, they seemed like ghosts, demons, wrathful messengers from hell. But to the Norse themselves, this was not cruelty. This was opportunity. At home, there were too many mouths to feed, too little land, too many second and third sons with no inheritance. Raiding was a solution, a rite of passage, a chance to gain wealth, honor, and status. If you returned home rich, you weren't a criminal, you were a hero, a man blessed by the gods. Back in Scandinavia, families built new longhouses, carved better ships, held feasts with stolen goblets. Women wore brooches from Francia. Warriors wielded swords forged from Frankish steel. And for every young boy listening at the hearth, one message was clear: the world is out there, and it is ours to take. But this era of hit-and-run violence was only the beginning. Soon, the Vikings would stop fleeing back to sea. They would begin to stay, to settle, to conquer, and to build something far more lasting than fear. They came as raiders, but they stayed as settlers. And in doing so, they began to change the world, not just with the sword, but with soil, speech, and stone. By the early 800s, Viking raids had become almost routine. Every summer, sails appeared along the coasts of England, Ireland, and Francia. Monasteries burned, villages vanished. Local rulers begged for aid or paid a tribute to be left alone. But the Norse were not content with gold alone. They wanted land. And so they began to stay. In the river valleys of Ireland, Vikings built fortified camps, called long forts. These were not just bases for loot, they were permanent settlements. Dublin began as one of these long forts, so Dedan ook Limerick, Wexford, Waterford. They became thriving trade hubs, linking Scandinavia with the rest of Europe and beyond. Soon, Norse traders were exchanging goods as far as Constantinople and Baghdad. Amber, furs, walrus ivory, and slaves flowed out of the north. Silks, silver coins, spices, and glass flowed in. But trade was just one piece of the transformation. In England, the Vikings carved out a vast region called the Danelaw, stretching from Northumbria through East Anglia down into Mercia. Here, Norse law ruled, Norse gods were worshipped, Norse language mingled with Old English, giving rise to many of the words we still use today: sky, egg, knife, husband, window. They built farms and villages, married locals, raised children who were half Saxon, half Norse. Even the image of the Viking as a brutal savage began to shift. Yes, there were still warriors, axe-wielding, fearless, bound for Valhalla. But there were also merchants, blacksmiths, shipwrights, women managing estates, children learning two tongues. In Normandy, a region of northern France, the Viking chieftain Rollo was granted land by the Frankish king in exchange for peace. Rollo swore fealty, converted to Christianity, married into nobility. His descendants would become the Dukes of Normandy. One of them, William, would later cross the Channel and conquer England in 1066. The Norse didn't just invade history, they wove themselves into it. But not everyone welcomed this change. Christian chroniclers still called them heathens. Warlords still saw them as threats. Kingdoms rose and fell resisting them. And within Scandinavia itself, something strange was happening. Wealth from raids and trade flooded home. Chieftains grew richer, more powerful, ambitious. Small, scattered tribes began to unify under kings. Ambitious men like Harald Fairhair in Norway, Gorm the Old in Denmark, and Olaf in Sweden. What had once been a culture of loose clans was becoming something more organized, more political, more imperial. The Vikings weren't disappearing, they were evolving. No longer just the terror of the seas, but founders of cities, shapers of law, writers of history, and soon builders of something even greater. Because far to the east, where rivers flowed like veins across endless plains, the Vikings would go where no one expected and carve out a whole new kind of empire. While kings in the west trembled at Viking sails, another world was awakening to their presence. One not of monasteries and farms, but of silk, gold, and empire. To the east of Scandinavia stretched an endless maze of rivers and forests. This was not Europe as we know it. It was a world of Slavic tribes, vast plains, and ancient trade routes, and it would soon become part of Viking history. The Norse who ventured here were different from their western cousins. They weren't just raiders, they were merchants, diplomats, founders. The Slavs called them Russ, a word many believe comes from rods or rowing men. These Norse traders followed river routes deep into modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, using the Volga, Dnieper, and Don like highways. They established trade posts at key points: Ladoga, Novgorod, Kiev. These were not just camps, they became cities. They traded furs, wax, honey, and slaves for silver, spices, silk, and wine from the east. At the southern end of the Dnieper lay a city of unimaginable wealth and beauty, Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire. To the Vikings, it was Miklagard, the great city. They were both awed by it and drawn to it. At first, they came in peace. Then, in 860, they came with fire. The Rus attacked Constantinople with a fleet of hundreds. They pillaged the suburbs, burned the outer walls, but they could not take the city itself. Still, they had made their mark. In time, they returned not as invaders, but as bodyguards. The Byzantine emperors, impressed by their strength and loyalty, recruited them into the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of axe-wielding Norse warriors who would serve for centuries. These men guarded emperors, marched in triumphs, and carved runes into the marble of Constantinople's palaces, some of which can still be seen today. But the influence of the Vikings in the East ran even deeper. By the 10th century, the Norse had merged with local Slavic elites, intermarried, adopted Christianity, and laid the foundations for the Kievan Rus, the first East Slavic state. Its rulers bore Norse names: Oleg, Igor, Olga, Sviatoslav, and yet they were no longer just Vikings. They were kings, lawmakers, nation builders. They wrote treaties, minted coins, and corresponded with emperors and popes. And from these roots would eventually grow the Russian state. So next time someone asks, "Where did the Vikings go?" tell them they became emperors in the East, guardians of Byzantium, and the fathers of a future empire. But even as their influence expanded, so too did something else. A change was coming to the Norse heartlands. A whisper, a cross, a new god, and with it, the end of the old world. For centuries, the Norse gods had reigned: Odin the Allfather, Thor the Thunderer, Freya, Loki, Heimdall, and the giants of frost and fire. Their stories filled the longhouses. Their names were carved into runestones. Their presence was felt in every storm, battle, and harvest. But no god rules forever. By the 10th century, change was creeping into the north. It didn't come with fire or war, but with whispers, with merchants, missionaries, and kings. Christianity had been spreading for centuries across Europe, and as the Vikings raided, traded, and settled, they met it again and again. At first, it was practical to convert. A Viking chieftain might get baptized in exchange for trade rights, peace treaties, or diplomatic recognition. But the old beliefs held strong. To many Norse, the Christian god seemed distant, abstract. Their gods were personal, proud, fierce. They drank and bled. They watched over warriors, not meek monks. But the world was changing, and to survive in it, the Norse would have to change too. In 965, King Harold Bluetooth of Denmark officially converted to Christianity. He united Denmark under one crown and one god. In Norway, King Olaf Tryggvason returned from exile in England with fire in his eyes and a cross in his hand. He didn't ask for conversion, he demanded it. Temples were burned, sacred groves cut down. Those who resisted were killed or exiled. It was not peaceful. In Iceland, the shift came differently. At the Althing, their great open-air parliament, the leaders debated, stay with the old ways or join the new. They chose Christianity, not by force, but for unity. Yet many continued to sacrifice to Thor in secret. The Norse world was now split. The gods were dying, not in battle, but in silence. No more offerings at the stone altars, no more blood on the earth for Odin, no more songs of Ragnarok around the fire. The old faith was fading, replaced by churches, Latin scrolls, and priests who saw the sagas as superstition. And yet, even in defeat, the Norse gods lingered, in memory, in folklore, in the symbols carved into stone and carried across oceans. They became part of the story of the North, not as literal deities, but as echoes of an identity, something proud, untamed, unbroken. The Vikings had bent to the world, but they had not disappeared. Their gods may have fallen, but their legacy was far from over, because on the edge of the world, one final Viking story was still waiting to be told. A journey unlike any before, to lands no Norseman had ever seen. They had conquered rivers, they had carved kingdoms, they had bent even gods to their will. But the Viking spirit was never just about conquest. It was about pushing limits, testing fate, sailing where no one else dared. And as the Viking world transformed, becoming Christian, feudal, royal, there were still some who looked west, to the unknown, to legend, to Vinland. It began with Eric the Red, a fiery outlaw from Norway, exiled from Iceland for murder. In search of new beginnings, he sailed west and discovered a vast icy land. He called it Greenland, a name meant to attract settlers. And it worked. Hundreds followed him, carving farms from frost, raising longhouses in valleys of snow and silence. They brought livestock, law, and lore. They lived in isolation, half forgotten, half mythic. But Eric's son would go further. Leif Erikson. Around the year 1000, Leif set sail from Greenland and reached a land of forests, rivers, and wild grapes. He called it Vinland. It may have been Newfoundland or farther south. The details are lost to time, but the story remains. The Vikings had reached North America 500 years before Columbus. They built a small settlement, traded with local indigenous tribes, clashed with them too. But the colony was short-lived, too far, too isolated, too dangerous. Vinland faded into legend. Still, for a brief moment, the Norse had stretched their world across 4 continents. From the Volga to Vinland, from Constantinople to the coasts of Ireland. No other people of the early Middle Ages matched their reach. And yet, this would be their final chapter. By the 11th century, the Viking Age was ending, not with a battle, but with absorption. Norse kings became Christian monarchs. Their children were taught Latin instead of runes. Armies became national. Raiding became treason. And in 1066, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the last great Viking king, Harald Hardrada, fell in battle, fighting to claim the English throne. 3 weeks later, William the Conqueror, a descendant of Norsemen himself, would win that throne instead. And with that, the Viking Age was over. But what they left behind cannot be measured in graves or ruins alone. They gave the world shipbuilding techniques that revolutionized sea travel, trade networks that linked continents, mythologies that still inspire, words, place names, and bloodlines that endure, and most of all, they left a story of wild men and wise rulers, of gods and gold, of terror and transformation. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were explorers, innovators, survivors, and though their age passed, their spirit lives on in every wind that calls us outward, in every risk we take into the unknown, in every fire we light against the dark, because the real history of the Vikings is not just about what they destroyed, it's about what they dared to begin.